everybody wants to get united. Like, what we gotta do is meet everybody on 149th Street at the bench.
Hey dudes, welcome back to Letter Science, a series where I teach you guys everything you know about a particular letter. Today we're covering the letter S and we're going over hand styles, throwies, and pieces, so without wasting any time at all, this right here is the S's basic structure. It consists of one flowing motion from the cap line all the way down to the baseline, and you'll notice that the top as well as the bottom is a lot more rounded, and having a rounded bottom means that you're going to be innately unstable as far as your weight is concerned. It's easy for this letter to either rock and fall over to this side or this side. So one of the best ways we can balance the letter S is if we focus on balancing its center of gravity. Now it doesn't have to be perfect, right? You don't have to be exact with how you balance the center of gravity. You can see that here it certainly isn't. It kind of leans a little bit as we go downward. But if you go from essentially the top center of this rounded portion and the bottom center of this rounded portion, if you try to get a straight line between those two areas, then your S is going to feel more grounded and more balanced, as you can see there. I probably should have drawn that in black, but you know, so be it, right? That works. Now that isn't to say that you can't lean the letter S. You certainly can, right? And in fact, it looks kind of nice when you do. Now when drawing the letter S, it's really important that we consider our cap line, our mean line, and our baseline. And while this is true for all letters, it's especially true for the letter S because of the ambiguity with its center. Nothing really separates the top of the S from the center of the S and the bottom of the S, structurally speaking. Unlike a lot of other letters where you have the stem and then you have a bowl that only comes down halfway, so on and so forth. So by focusing on our cap line, mean line, and baseline, we're able to kind of structurally define each section. Our rounded portion encompassing most of the cap line, and then we begin this bend inward as we near the mean line, and then as we exit the mean line right around here is when we begin the bend back down. And when you put that in one smooth motion, you end up with a really clean S. Now the letter S is one of the most versatile letters in the alphabet. We can do a lot with this letter, and you can see that right here. We have our standard S right here, but then the second one right next to it has a much larger top portion, and then we kind of narrow out on the lower portion and make it a little bit smaller. Notice though, our bend in the center that we just talked about still happens around the mean line in much the same way. All that happens is that we changed the trajectory of the top and the bottom. On the other hand, you can also do the same thing the other way around and get a very different looking S. This S looks really unstable, while the one beside it looks a lot more stable despite the fact that it's the same structure. We did the same thing, just in reverse. So we have a much more kind of shrunk top based on the trajectory. We still do the mean line, the same as we did for these previous two, but now we change the trajectory of the bottom to be much larger. And now, given this much larger surface that meets the baseline, our letter S looks a lot more stable. But what happens if we start to actually mess around with a mean line? Now you'll have to forgive me, our mean line is still drawn here in the center, but understand for these next two examples, the letter S's mean line is definitely not in this center. It's more so around here. As you can see, we have that bend, that transition happening right around this area, where we exit the top and we enter the bottom rotation. So in this example, we allow a lot more space for the top rotation up here, and then we exit that rotation much later in the letter S, and then we enter the bottom rotation. Same thing happens here. It's pretty much the same exact S, but now we've added a serif to it. Now that right there, in and of itself, is a lot of letter S's, but it doesn't stop there. That's just the round stroke for the letter S, but now we have more angular strokes, and then you get all of these variations, which if you read my book, then you know all about this, and you know how to use these and like how best to kind of manipulate them, because we talk all about variant structures and style and how that affects things. But to go over it very quickly here, this is just a variant structure S. If you need a tutorial on variant structures, we have a tutorial on that right up here, and we even wrote an entire blog post that teaches you everything you need to know about it and shows you all the variant structures for the alphabet. We got that linked in the description down below. If you're interested in the book, it'll teach you all of graffiti's fundamentals with hundreds of pictures throughout the book that help to teach each lesson, which is perfect for new graffiti artists because it guides you down the path, helping you to learn. But it's also great for experienced graffiti artists, as we have an insane amount of depth in that book, topics that have never been talked about in graffiti. You'll find the book in the description down below. We have digital copies over on our online store, theartistblock.inc, where you can use this coupon code for a bit of a discount. And then over on Amazon, we have physical copies of the book. Both links down below. But with your more angular S's, they also lose a lot of stability because they have one really small contact point with the actual baseline. So these tend to be a little bit harder for newer graffiti artists to use, but definitely not impossible. And it's going to follow the same exact balancing convention that we previously talked about of balancing the center of gravity, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but as long as it's, you know, pretty close, you should be good. And sometimes you don't want it to be balanced. Sometimes you want it to look like it's leaning a little bit, and that can work perfectly well as well, especially depending on the context of your hand style and the letters beside it. it. Now personally, some of my favorite S's are a mixture of the two, right? We have the more angular top or bottom, it really wouldn't matter, and then instead we add a more rounded section to the opposite side. So we started off with an angle here, and then we add a round on the bottom. We started off with a round up here, and then we add an angle on the bottom. And then, you know, we kind of follow the same thing where now we can start to mix that up, where now maybe our angle stops higher, much higher above the mean line, but then we begin the rounded immediately after, making that rounded portion a lot larger. On the other hand, we can also end the angular structure much lower below the mean line, and then do the rounded structure for a much smaller bottom. And then of course we can also begin to add some leans in there, so on and so forth, and each of these is a very different S. And that's just scratching the surface, because we have yet to even go over your more square or more compound strokes here. Now, in all honesty, the square, like the purely square ones, are some of my least favorite structures. That's a personal thing, some people do amazing stuff with those, right? But the square S's tend to be very stable, especially when you give them a square bottom, because that bottom holds all of the weight that you can possibly add to the top and immediately stabilizes the letter. But when you put that same square on a rounded or an angular, then all of that weight at the top is a beautiful contrast to the lack of stability on the bottom. But you do have to know how to weigh your letters out and weigh your name overall, because doing something like these is going to shift the weight of your name very heavily. Your compound strokes here I also really like, because they have serifs kind of built into it, more structured kind of serifs built into the letter structure itself, and they offer a lot of contrast, as they have both your more angular and rounded kind of structures there. And these are also some of my favorite S's for that reason, and in fact this right here is one of my favorites. I like that quite a bit. But that, you know, is largely personal preference. With the letter S, when we look at its letter name weight and we have just the rounded S, it's got a pretty decent weight to it. The angular structures though tend to lack a lot of weight, while the square structures tend to have an abundant amount of weight. Now here we're talking specifically about weight in relation to the size and how heavy the letter will be based on that. But when we begin to look at weight based on its stability and attention, things change up quite a bit. The rounded and the angular S's, as far as the angled bottom and the rounded bottom, those are naturally unstable, and they gain attention as a result of that. So whatever they didn't have as far as weight in relation to their size, they're certainly going to make up for it with how unstable they can be. The letter S is also really easy to flow no matter what kind of structure you begin with. Granted, flow happens automatically if your fundamentals are correct, so if you're having flow issues no matter the letter, then there's something wrong with your fundamentals. Also, the letter S is very easy to position just because of the simple fact that most of its structures can be easily overlapped without losing the actual, like, the identity of the letter itself. And as long as you're following your cap line, mean line, and baseline, the negative space management is pretty automatic on these letters. But where we do start to see a change is when we get to throwies and pieces. So when we zoom out here and we look at all these different S's, we've done like 20 plus S's here that are all pretty unique and different in their own way, and that's not even scratching the surface. We can easily do hundreds and they would all be original to us, and at no point did we have to look at anybody's work to come up with any of these. And this is exactly why it's important to learn hand styles, because all of this information is directly applicable to our throwies. This isn't any different than what we previously covered. This is still just our basic S that we've seen before, just with some normal general shapes around it. And what's great is, depending on how you squish these shapes and stretch them out, you can get really different looks for the same exact structure. So here we have our one line S, and then here we have the same exact one line S. And either one of those could be your basic S, right? This is the S in its absolute simplest form. This is the S with a little bit of squished structure on the top. And just like before, we can mix things up, and now we've added a serif to each of them. But the actual structure itself remains the same. Now, when we did hand styles, we took a look at rounded structures, we took a look at angular structures, so on and so forth. You could do all of those same exact structures in throwies as well. So all the stuff that we're showing here with throwies is just the rounded structure. But we could decide to do a more square top S with the serif, as we just talked about, where we also enlarged the top portion as well. And then we've got more angle top S's here, where once again we have an angle for the top, and then we just mixed in a different bottom, right? A different shape for each bottom here. And you can see how those very simple changes makes each one of these look really unique. And all the properties that we talked about in the hand style applies to the throwie as well. So when you have that rounded bottom, you're going to have a little bit of stability. When you have that angular bottom, you're still going to maintain that lack of stability. And when you have that square bottom, you're going to have an excess amount of stability. All that stuff remains the same. Here we experiment with how we could change the letter S progressively over a few different iterations. Here, nothing really fancy is happening. We have an angle top, and then we come on down for the bottom, where we begin a serif on the lower portion. But what happens if I want the S to look a little bit more detailed? Well, we can simply just include some negative space, and you can see that right here. I decide, you know what, maybe it's better for the actual speed of the throwie if we don't have this this middle portion overlap this lower portion. So instead, now we begin our throwy here, we come around for the angle stroke, we come on down, and look at that. One fluid motion for the throwy S. And as you'll notice when we zoom out, suddenly now you can see that we have a much different S than what we initially began with. And in theory, you can do that with any one of these. Now with throwy letter S's, the weight of these letters changes from their handstyle counterparts, because now suddenly what the angular structure lacked in size, it can easily make up for with the natural chunkiness of the throwies in general. Throwies tend to be fat, and that's going to benefit the angular S quite a bit, giving it a lot of strength that it didn't have in its handstyle counterpart. It still has that lack of stability, as does the rounded S, and the rounded S also gains the same benefit where it gains a lot of weight, a lot of chunkiness, and a lot of fat because of just how fat throwies are. But this also can work to the detriment of your more square S's, as now the already fat and heavy square structure of the S becomes even more so as a result of throwies in general. Negative space management really shouldn't be any issue in any of these structures until you start intentionally including proper negative space instead of suggesting it. Once we actually start to include the negative space, we risk having the S become more of a straight letter. And for the rounded structure being as simplistic as it is with one basic box as far as its piecing structure is concerned, it's really easy for that to become a straight letter in throwies, and that really doesn't change for the angled or the square structure as well. So do keep an eye out for that, because in all honesty it is also very easily avoidable. While it's easy for it to happen, it's easily avoidable, so you want to find that balance. Now for our piecing structures. Pieces, as far as S is concerned, these things are ridiculously stylistic and extremely versatile. If you haven't noticed with the handstyles as well, all of that still applies here. We still have an innate unstable nature to both the rounded and the angular bottoms for the S's, and more stability for the more square bottoms. But what's cool about the piecing structure specifically is now we can change our terminals, and we can change how certain basic boxes share their angle to lend more stability. As you can see here, normally our angles come to a point, but they don't have to with pieces. We can have a much more straight shear to the edge there, and if that was on the bottom, that would give us a lot more stability. So with very tiny changes, piecing structures can change a lot of their basic qualities that just come baked into the letter itself. Now, our rounded structures have a decent amount of weight to them. However, the more angular versions of the letter S tend to have a lot less weight. Now, once we start adding style, that can certainly change. We can certainly extend parts of the letter and, you know, it's still angular, but now it has a lot more weight. But we're talking about the natural qualities of the letter itself. So when we look at the square structures, these have an abundant amount of weight. Now, as far as letter S and its piecing variations, the rounded structure S gains a lot of size with these areas in particular, as they tend to normally be a lot wider. So the scale that the handstyle counterpart lacked, suddenly the piecing counterpart gains back in these areas. And in all honesty, it's really easy to make these sections also pretty big, so you can get a lot of weight back. But we still do keep that unbalanced nature to the letter, as we do with the angled bottom as well. The angled bottom still lacks a lot of that presence, a lot of that weight from its natural size, which you can clearly see here, and the square S's are going to retain pretty much all the fundamentals that we previously talked about. When using the square S's, you really do have to be concerned with how much weight is in that structure and how it compares to the rest of your name. This is going to change from name to name, and you'll have to examine it on a case-by-case basis, but as long as you keep it in mind and you keep it in the forefront of your mind, you'll be able to avoid any issues. Alright dudes, that pretty much wraps it up. Don't forget, you can download this file over on a secret little link if you made it this far into the video in the description down below. It comes in PDF, PNG, PSD, and Procreate, so you can, pretty much anybody can use the file. Hopefully this helped you guys out. I think with this series I'm going to try and shorten it a bit and cover the letters that you guys want to see instead of going through the entire alphabet. So let me know what letters next in the comments down below. Now if you found this video helpful, you're going to love the book we went ahead and published. It'll teach you how things like flow and negative space management and letter name weight all correlate to one another. Grab the digital ebook over on the artistblock.inc, linked in the description down below, and that's where the coupon code will work. And if you're more interested in the physical version, check out the Amazon link to the book in the description down below. Want more graffiti tutorials? Check out the best how to do graffiti playlist anywhere online right over here, with more graffiti content right down here. And I'll catch you guys back here next week. Thanks for watching.